Right, that's business stories, but it's time to look at the stories making headlines on newspapers across Nigeria this morning. And on Skype with me is the managing editor, the Avalon Daily, Ayodele Adio, joining me on Skype. Ayodele, good morning. It's good to have you join me right now.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Great. Now let's begin with the Blueprint newspaper this morning. Blueprint says federal government warns as customers choke up banks markets in FCT, that's the Federal Capital Territory, Lagos and Ogun. That's what you see on the front page of the Blueprint. Compliance on face masks, social distancing low. That's the Presidential Task Force on COVID-19 is saying this. Urges banks to improve online service, stock ATM machines. And traders forcefully open markets in Kano. And Edo arrests face masks violators. And 101 vehicles, occupants arrested in Zamfara as well. Okay, you find all that on the front page of the Blueprint newspaper. The Leadership newspaper is next now. And it says China tackles US, UK over source of coronavirus. You know, this controversy has been on for quite a while, accusing China of spreading the coronavirus. No nation can fight pandemic alone. This is PMB, the President Muhammadu Buhari is saying this. It says 3.6 million Nigerians benefited from cash transfer. And Chinese doctors working in isolation centers. The federal government is saying this. WHO backs use of scientifically proven traditional medicine for COVID-19. An assistant police commissioner dies in Kano. A state gets more donations from NNPC, Nestle, PLC, and Chevron. Okay, that's the Leadership newspaper. There, let's go to Daily Trust. Daily Trust is the next paper right now. Restrictions take toll on Muslims during Ramadan. It's talking about COVID-19 and most difficult Ramadan ever. Katsina, Kano, Kaduna residents are saying this, and scholars adopt virtual social media teaching, and lawyers share experiences, clarify Ramadan practices. And certainly on the front page of the Daily Trust, you see long queues of people waiting at the banks to get cash in parts of Lagos and Ogun. All right, from there, let's go to Daily Times. Daily Times says Nigeria's poorest people, now 82.9 million, and that's according to the National Bureau of Statistics. Lists Sokoto, Taraba, Jigawa, Ebonyi, Adamawa as states with high poverty rates. Expert urges federal government to increase spending on agriculture to address issues raised in NBS report. All right, my guests will certainly be interested in this when we open the discussions. All right, from Daily Times, let's go to News Direct, which is the last paper I'll be looking at right now. Post-COVID-19 lockdown, customers storm banks over cash crisis. All right, customers storm commercial banks over cash crisis. Certainly, a lot of people on social media has been lots of videos and pictures of how people were at the banks and at the bus stops and in buses and in different places when following the easing of, or partly easing the lockdown yesterday. All right, let's get into the discussions now. Ayodele, if you're still there with me, the story on the Daily Times, certainly this will interest Nigerians. Nigeria's poorest people, now 82.9 million, according to the National Bureau of Statistics. Now, these figures are really scary. But the point there is, these are the issues we've been talking about over the years. I remember even having you on the show that we've been talking about this issue for the past months. Talk to us basically, how does this come to you when you see these figures?
First of all, the figures are alarming, but not very unsurprising. I mean, we've always known that millions of Nigerians are desperately poor, and from that figures, it tells you that essentially 4 out of every 10 Nigerians are, extremely poor, and that's by the calculation of the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics. That means that they live on about 137,000 naira in a year, which is about 365 naira, 370 naira a day, essentially $1 per day. That's quite alarming. And to have about 82.9, essentially 83 million people of your citizens, and that's if you take out the numbers from Borno State, where they were unable to calculate the figures there for insecurity issues and all of that. You have an extremely poor situation where 40% of the people in your country are living from hand to mouth and essentially on survival mode. And that's largely of a consequence of several years of negligence, several years of the government's inability to diversify from an oil-dependent economy, several years of the government's inability to build the requisite infrastructure and to spread the wealth, from a very tiny elite, across the country. Because I think also, if you look closely at our inequality index, it's about 35%, almost at 40%, which is also quite high. So I mean, it's years of negligence in terms of diversifying the economy and building the requisite infrastructure. And unfortunately, again, we have a situation where our population is outstripping our growth. That's our GDP. So you have population at about 4.5% every year, and we're growing at about 2%. So essentially, our population is outstripping our rate of growth, which is also putting pressure on the infrastructure we have. You have less hospitals to cater to citizens. You have less schools, than your population requires. So essentially, we're in for a huge ride, and it's a shame, that close to 60 years after independence, we're still grappling with hunger and poverty.
Now, the government has been doing so much. Certainly, whether one agrees with the government or doesn't agree with the government, governments have been doing so much over the years with billions and trillions of naira earmarked for budgets. Besides the federal government, the state governments are also, reading out billions of naira, doing so much for the people. But we still have the numbers of poor people in states increasing. What do you think is the biggest missing link here, with all the monies earmarked for projects and to assist the people and the number of poor people increasing?
I think the problem, again, is the assumption that there's been huge billions and billions being budgeted for citizens in Nigeria. The country is essentially poor, as against what we would like to hear, what our grandfathers told us, that we're an oil-rich economy. In essence, if you do on a per capita basis, you essentially leave every Nigerian with less than 600 naira, which is extremely poor if you compare that, with middle-income countries like South Korea, which has a per capita of about to $4,000. We have about $426, if I'm not mistaken, per capita. So you see that we're an extremely poor country. Unfortunately, again, most of the monies that we budget are not targeted, at infrastructure or capital projects. They are basically funding consumption. So close to 50% of your budget is on salaries and overheads, and very little goes into critical infrastructure, such that the World Bank has also predicted that in 2024, we might be spending 75% of our revenue on servicing debt. So we're not a rich country. Our budget is essentially broke. We don't, in fact, the fire service of New York has essentially a bigger budget, close to a bigger budget, than more than half of the Nigerian states combined. So you're a poor country. What we need to do is to diversify the economy from its overdependence on oil and see how the country can gain essentially from agriculture, because more than 50% of Nigeria, or the states in Nigeria, is largely an agrarian economy. So the question is, what can we do to add value to agriculture in our country and to export these value-added products across the world? The moment we begin to do that, we'll begin to earn more foreign exchange outside the volatility of the oil industry. And of course, again, we also need to develop a productive base. wherein we build the requisite infrastructure, essentially borrow what the Ethiopians are doing, which is to create clusters across your country where you can target specific infrastructural projects, which is power, road network for logistics, so that big manufacturing companies can set up in those locations and government can provide infrastructure in those locations and attract foreign direct investments to those particular places that can create jobs and employ hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. So there's a whole lot that we can do, and a 20 minutes program would not allow us to talk about certain things that we can do. But one thing you need to realize that we're an extremely poor country where the GDP per capita is less than $500 per day, which is shocking, which is hopelessly poor, and we need to do a whole lot more to improve our revenue base and to effectively distribute wealth across our citizens. And you can't do that without building the requisite infrastructure. You can't do that without managing population growth vis-a-vis, the growth rate of the economy. And you cannot do that without diversifying the economy from oil.
All right. Now, in the last 5 years, the last 5-6 years, if you follow the yearly review of the poverty rates in the country by NBS and all of that, Sokoto State, for instance, has featured as continually or repeatedly as one of the states with the highest rates of poverty in the country. For a state like that, what do you think they should be doing now, or how helpless is the state in turning around the fortunes of the state? Because if we all have to wait for the federal government, it seems obvious that the federal government doesn't have the magic wand to turn things around overnight.
Listen, I don't think a state like Sokoto is helpless or hopeless. I think what needs to happen is that states need to begin to focus. I think a lot of states are trying to do too many things at the same time. And states need to identify what exactly their comparative advantage is as against other states and focus on that comparative advantage that they have. So for a state like Sokoto, essentially, again, it has to be agriculture. I know that they have certain mineral resources like limestone and cobalt and what have you, but I'm not sure state governments have the powers to extract those mineral resources, to add value to them and export. So they are left with agriculture. So they need to find a comparative advantage in agriculture, and it's impossible for single states to come out of this mess alone. So I think not Western states will need to start thinking strategically as a region wherein you can build infrastructure that you need to connect markets to production sites so that people can move the agricultural products from their farmlands into the market. I think that is very important because 50% of the agricultural products are perished for lack of adequate storage or transportation.
All right.
The government might need to invest in intensive irrigational systems. They need to invest in mechanized farming. So I think if state governments focus in where they have a comparative advantage, they can quickly leapfrog their poverty that they found themselves in. And I think states also need to start setting up their own Bureau of Statistics where they can measure growth and progress in their own individual states, because what is not measured can never be improved.
All right.
Over time.
All right, we have to leave it here now. Thank you very much, Ayodele Adio, for your time on the program. All right, it's time for the paper review now. Let's see what the headlines are across Nigeria. And I have with me on Skype the managing editor of National Daily, Ayodele Adio. Ayodele, it's good to have you join me on the paper review. Great.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Now let's start from the Blueprint newspaper. It says the federal government warns as customers choke up banks, markets in the FCT, Lagos and Ogun. You see compliance on face masks, social distancing low. That's the PTF is saying that. The Presidential Task Force urges banks to improve online service, stock ATM machines. Traders forcefully open market in Kano, and Edo arrest face mask violations or violators. 101 vehicles occupants arrested in Zamfara. All right, I guess certainly these stories will interest Ayodele when we start the discussions. Leadership newspaper, on the other hand, says China tackles US, UK over source of coronavirus. All right, and from there, Daily Trust is the next paper now and is focusing on COVID-19. Daily Trust, it says, restrictions take toll on Muslims during Ramadan. Most difficult Ramadan ever. Katsina, Kano, Kaduna residents saying that. And scholars adopt virtual social media teaching. And lawyers share experiences, clarify Ramadan practices, exactly. All right, that's Daily Trust. From there, let's go to Daily Times. That says Nigeria's poorest people, now 82.9 million people. That's according to the National Bureau of Statistics. The list: Sokoto, Taraba, Jigawa, Ebonyi, Adamawa are states with high poverty rates. And experts urge federal government to increase spending on agric to address issues raised in the MBS report. From Daily Times, let's go now to News Direct, which is the last paper now. Post-COVID-19 lockdown, customers storm commercial banks over cash crisis. All right, customers storm commercial banks over cash crisis. Now, Adele, let me come to you on this. I know you have monitored and seen the mass turnout of people yesterday. It was like breaking loose of people, of someone who has suffocated from lack of air, and then eventually you have air, and then you jubilate and all of that. Now, from the banks to the markets to the bus stops to even parks, yesterday was something else. What did you notice?
Well, again, it wasn't unexpected. I noticed that commercial buses were filled to the brim. There was very little attention given to social or physical distancing, if you'd like. Buses were cramped up, markets were full, banks were crowded. A lot of people wanted to go withdraw their widow's mite from the bank, and people who had certain transactions that could not be carried out over a mobile app also had to go to the bank, to get a few things done. So you had essentially crowded places all over the city of Lagos, and that's largely because you had, kept people away for 5 weeks. So it wasn't shocking to see that the birds, when the cage opened, the birds were everywhere in the sky, trying to get a bit of fresh air. And so it wasn't shocking to see anyway. But it was fearful, and it was worrisome that there was very little regard for physical distancing, and people essentially violated all of the precautionary measures, all of the warning. People just went about their business as though the coronavirus was a hoax, and that's quite worrisome. And I expect that the government will ramp up its public campaign to ensure that there's personal responsibility from citizens to ensure that every precautionary measure is adhered to. People wear their face masks, people maintain physical distancing, people wash their hands, maintain perfect hygiene, so that we can essentially manage this crisis.
All right, I was asking one of my guests earlier on, what do you make of the capacity to instill a compliance? Because the point there is that the government has given advice and given instructions. The health officials or health experts have given their, or health authority, if I have to put it that way, have given their instructions and advice. Stay home. If you don't have to be out, don't go out. Maintain social distancing, use face masks, wash your hands. Oh, these are advice that have been on all the while. But when it comes to the level where there are restrictions and there are partial restrictions and all of that, what do you make of the capacity of government to instill a compliance to those instructions?
I mean, it's very weak. The government actually, to be fair and to be candid, lacks the capacity to enforce such very wide and broad compliance amongst Lagosians. You're talking about 20 million people. How many police do you have in Lagos? Less than 50,000. I wonder how they're going to make that happen. It's totally impossible to enforce, and so this will largely depend on personal responsibility, and that's why I said that the government needs to ramp up its public campaign to ensure that citizens are compliant, that citizens put up their best behavior, and that their brother's keeper. Listen, it's the government's job to use whatever strategy it wants. It could use fear mongering, it could use whatever it chooses to do. It could solicit help from religious leaders, it could solicit help, from public affairs personalities, from celebrities, whatever it needs to do to raise, a red alert, public awareness on the deadliness of this virus, to ensure that people take the right steps, people make the right decisions, and people follow or obey all orders and precautionary measures to ensure that this virus does not spread. Otherwise, if you expect to put policemen to enforce people wearing masks and and people maintaining physical distancing, it will be an effort in futility. You'll just end up blinking in the dark. It wouldn't make any sense, and it will be impossible to enforce. So you have to rest it squarely on the table of the individual to take that personal responsibility to ensure that he preserves his life, that of his family, and that of his neighbor. And to do that, he needs to obey all the laid down rules and regulation and follow every precautionary measure. So it's about personal responsibility here. The police can do as far as they can, to maintain certain order. We can't rely on the police to maintain security, then rely on them again to ensure that you take the right step to protect your own self and your own family. I think it's going a bridge too far.
All right.
We need to take personal responsibilities for ourselves and make the right decisions, and government needs to ramp up that public campaign to ensure that we take that step.
All right, with more community transmission being reported across the country and in places like Lagos, Abuja, and even Kano right now, and the numbers are going up by the day in hundreds. Do you see likely another lockdown going forward with the way things are going?
Let me be very honest with you. We're going to be dealing with this virus till December. Big pharmaceuticals have that visited the White House, I think last week, made a promise to Trump that the earliest that a vaccine will be out will be in December. So we accept that there is some miracle, and I know that you have a lot of churches in Nigeria and very religious people in Nigeria and mosques across. Except by our fasting and prayer, something dramatic happens, we'll be living with this coronavirus till December. So except you want to lock down the entire country from now to December and kill everybody with hunger and starvation, that's the route you'd have to take. Otherwise, just like Bill Gates rightfully argued, that poor African countries will need to find a fine line between ensuring public health, public safety, and economic management. So we have to walk that fine line to ensure that while we're doing what is necessary to keep people safe and people healthy, we are also taking the right steps to ensure that the economy is not completely broken down. Remember, the NBS has just released its report where it says about 83 million people are extremely poor, and the measure of that is earning 137,000 naira per year. 60% of Nigerians function in an informal sector where they have to work every day to earn a living. So you have a lot of people who are living on the fringes in Nigeria, and to continue to lock down the economy. And here's the funny thing. You're not locking down the economy because you're working on a vaccine or you're working on a solution. You are actually essentially locking down the economy in hope. And you know that hope is not a strategy. So if, for instance, the government was locking down to fund research institutions or to fund development of vaccines or to fund the development of a cure or something, then you would understand that, okay, there is an exit strategy here. But as we speak, there is absolutely no exit strategy. It is dependent on hope that for some reason the virus will disappear from the sky. And that's not a strategy in itself. So my argument is, while it is you're going to see the numbers go up the next few days or in the next few weeks, it will be a very tough decision for you to lock down the commercial centers of the country again, because the government cannot afford a knockdown. It can't afford palliatives. It can't afford a huge stimulus package that the Western countries have done. So we really, really need to walk a fine line. And that's where, again, I reemphasize that this has to rest squarely on personal responsibility, and the government needs to find a way to ensure that citizens are responsible enough to take every precautionary measure seriously to ensure that they are keeping themselves safe, their families, and ensure that they don't put their neighbors in harm's way.
All right. Thank you so much, Adele Adio, for your time on the program this morning. Thank you.